Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Rhapsody in Cinema, the podcast where we talk about movies, memories, and everything in between. If you've seen my little spiel or heard it on the RSS feed, what this podcast is basically me talking one-on-one with people about their favorite movie. And to start us off for this episode, I am joined by a man that we tend to call the man of 1,000 podcasts, Aldo Gomez. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing, Romney?
I'm doing pretty good. I mean, had a bit of a scare when I accidentally pocket dialed 911, but can't really complain.
Well, that's at least you didn't need it, so that's I guess the better news.
Yeah, and speaking of potentially freaking out emergency personnel, it kind of ties into the film we're actually going to be discussing for this first episode, and that film being Spider-Man. Now, for those of you listening at home, the specific film we're talking about is the very first Spider-Man film directed by Sam Raimi, starring Tobey Maguire and Willem Dafoe. And so I will go ahead and go right into this. Aldo Gomez, why is Spider-Man your favorite movie?
It has to tie into the fact that he's also like my favorite hero. And it's one of those things where I still think even to this day, even with its early 2000s CGI imagery that it has, I still think it holds up. It's an excellent combination of humor, drama, action. It plays itself very seriously, but at the same time, it knows it's a comic book movie. It has fun with it. And I think it nailed the formula really well even before the big comic book boom. And really the only stuff that had come out before it that had been so mainstream had been the Superman movies with Christopher Reeves, as well as the Tim Burton and Schumacher Batman movies that had come out like a decade earlier.
Yeah, and especially when you consider prior to this release, the only other Marvel film that had done really well had been Blade. It was pretty much after X-Men that there was still a lot of uncharted territory when it came to superhero films, and I'm kind of right there with you. Spider-Man is one of my favorite characters, and this was one of the big films from my childhood, so I was actually kind of excited that I got to look at it again.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, because so you had mentioned that it was kind of the first Spider-Man movie. It's not really. There had been like 2 or 3 other movies before it. I don't think there were big Hollywood productions, but there was one like in 76. Then there was like the Spider-Man movie from Japan and like one from the 60s.
Oh yeah, because the 70s one, the American one, was part of the very short-lived television series back when they were basically making Marvel TV shows, the only success of which was the Hulk. And yeah. I've seen bits of the Japanese TV show, and that's a whole separate can of worms. A very fun, insane can of worms, but can of worms nonetheless.
Yeah.
Fun would definitely be a good way I would describe the movie after watching it again, and especially when you look at a lot of superhero movies that are just so afraid to have any levity. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but it definitely was a breath of fresh air.
Right, but at the same time, though, I think, there's movies that are afraid of any levity, but I think there's also movies that are very afraid to just have a serious moment. You have that with, like, a lot of the newer Marvel movies, where there's a joke. Every 5 minutes, there's a joke, right? Every serious scene is punctuated by a joke. This movie, Spider-Man, it's not afraid to just have an emotional moment and end that emotional moment before it moves on, and then it cracks a joke.
Well, yeah, especially when you're tackling a character like Spider-Man, that's kind of important, where he's not just cracking jokes just to crack jokes. For him, it's a coping mechanism. It's basically what he does to keep from, well, shaking in fear of the fact that any given moment he could very well die.
Yeah. And that's one of those things I've always loved about Spider-Man, like in the comics particularly, is that he's such a mid-tier hero in terms of power, right? Like, he's just, depending on the writer, but typically he's, just stronger than like an average person, probably Captain America levels. But he's not invincible, so when you put him up against the Hulk and Thor and stuff like that, he pretty much is the equivalent of like a normal person in comparison. And I think that's one of the things that this movie does, because this was before the big crossover cinematic universe stuff, but you still get that sense of, yeah, he's stronger than the average person, but if you throw him up against the wall, he's still gonna get hurt.
Yeah, especially, and that's something that they did not shy away from, that I think a lot of the newer movies have kind of been shying away from for the sake of international release, because even in the newer Marvel movies, yeah, they get a little roughed up, but nothing more than maybe occasional scratches. But here you see his costume get straight up deteriorated, especially during his final fight with the Goblin. And that kind of goes into another thing where it's very much something I've kind of started to appreciate now that I've viewed it again as an adult after seeing some of Sam Raimi's other films, just kind of the Raimi-isms. Not so much that they're out of place, but they're very much, you can tell that even Raimi himself was having fun with the film.
I think one of the things I loved, so growing up, I didn't know who Sam Raimi was. My uncle did. He was a big fan of the Evil Dead movies. So when it was him that was going to be directing it, he was excited, and I got excited for no reason. I was just like, yeah, Spider-Man movie. But, like you, having familiarized myself with Raimi's backlog after the fact, there's a lot of great things that Raimi does that also spill over into the rest of the Spider-Man movies. But you can tell that he is like a horror director at heart, essentially. He does a lot of really, I don't want to say creepy because they don't come across as creepy in the movie because of the context, but it has a lot of horror techniques, like a lot of shadowy stuff, like a lot of shadowy movements, a lot of jump scares, a lot of just kind of setups that in a horror movie work perfectly fine. And in here, I think they work well.
It definitely helps build up the atmosphere, because even with the outdated CGI, that was one thing that I really also took away, was just how it set the mood and set the atmosphere, once again balancing both the humor and the genuine terror. Much like you, I didn't know who Raimi was, but I just remember... I remember being excited because I was a fan of the cartoon, and then watching it, my favorite scene in particular is just watching Willem Dafoe kind of change between Norman Osborn and the Goblin. That was kind of the thing that made me want to try acting, because I can imagine that must have been really fun to do on set.
And I think it's funny because I think it worked out for the best. I know a lot of people were disappointed they didn't do the full prosthetic Goblin mask that would have had the moving eyes and everything. But I think at the end of the day, what we got here, which was a Sentai Ranger type suit, worked really well, because I couldn't tell at the time. I don't know if it was just CRT TV quality, but watching it again on HD, Blu-ray on a nice television, you can see his eyes and mouth behind the mask, especially on that rooftop scene where he's talking about, they'll spit you, they'll take you in, they'll spit you out. You can really see his eyes and mouth, and you can tell he's totally in the character. He's having fun.
Yeah, and I've actually seen screen tests that Raimi did with the more prosthetic type mask, and it would not have worked. It was too far on the creepy spectrum. Of course, it didn't help that he gave the actor directions like, make love to the camera.
That's true. And you know what, though? I still don't know how you convince Willem Dafoe to dress up like the Green Power Ranger and cackle. But, he did it, and it worked out super well. And I think it's funny because kind of getting ready for the Death Note, Netflix stuff that's going to come out. And I was kind of like, really? Willem Dafoe looks like Ryuk, but is he really going to embrace the role? And then watching this movie again, I'm like, yeah, he's going to knock it out of the park. I think Willem Dafoe likes to have fun every once in a while.
I was recently looking at one of his earlier films, Streets of Fire, and you can tell even back then when he was younger, he was the kind of person who would have fun. He seems to like playing villains or really characters that just are the kind of unhinged, very terrifying sort of characters. Even back then, you can tell he was really into it.
I would say he's the serious side of Robin Williams, because Robin Williams also all over the spectrum, but always making you laugh, while Willem Dafoe all over the spectrum, but always making you want to crap yourself in the pants.
Indeed, indeed. And I think it was definitely a good fit with Raimi's directing style of adding those horror tinges, especially when you consider that was kind of the Goblin's sort of mystique. It was basically, in the comics, he was basically, okay, it's a Halloween costume come to life, and it was basically oh yeah, it's fun and silly, but then you realize, oh yeah, those pumpkin bombs, they actually kill people.
Yeah, and I think it's funny too, because in the comics, he was very much this consistent thing, right? In a horror movie, he's essentially the alien. He's always a step ahead of Spider-Man. He's always doing stuff more. And while we only really get him for the one movie here, because Spider-Man apparently started the trend of killing off your villains in the first movie, it's done really well because, in the comics, he's kind of a step ahead and stuff like that. And so we as an audience know what he knows, but when we see it through Spider-Man's eyes, he has absolutely no idea who he is, what he knows or what he doesn't know until the end. And it's kind of this cat and mouse game, except it's really one-sided.
And that kind of goes into another thing I really liked, And I think it's kind of the reason why people kind of got frustrated with and not another origin story, was because this one devoted a lot of time to really introducing us to the character and the world of Spider-Man. Like, going into the motivation of who Peter Parker was before the spider bite, and kind of slowly building up everything that followed after. And that was something I didn't really notice before as a kid, because I was like, oh yeah, I like it, but I'm waiting for the action. But to hear him just like, hey, Raimi actually took his time here.
There's a lot of exposition in like the first half hour, 45 minutes of the movie, but it's not like verbal exposition. Like, he shows you stuff. He's gonna let you pick up on it. Like, from the very beginning, we know that he's getting bullied. He's not popular because the kids are laughing. He's running after the bus, but he punctuates that by having even the bus driver laughing. Even he's laughing and driving away, and he's kind of aware. And it's just kind of this thing where he kind of lets you figure out who Peter Parker is without, giving you like verbal exposition, right? Like, he doesn't tell you. You don't have characters go up to Peter Parker and be like, "Oh, Parker, you photography nerd again. What are you doing taking photos? Blah blah. What are you gonna be, a newspaper photographer?" No. Our real first kind of instance of seeing him with other classmates is also him with the camera working for the school paper. So, like, there's a lot of stuff that happens that when you get to the later stuff, when he's like, I'm thinking of taking a job in photography, it's natural. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. But we also haven't been hit over the head with the fact that, like, he likes being a photographer.
I remember with that whole scene of him talking with Uncle Ben, I mean, in every speech class I was in junior high where you had to give a speech, like, oh, choose a quote to talk about it, literally everyone chose that scene because it was easy to remember and the quote sticks with you. Everyone could pretty much, even not having seen the film, can recite it by heart. The whole with great power comes great responsibility. But just even with that delivery, yeah, some people may say it's kind of hokey, but it works because that's kind of how the film sets itself up. Yeah, this is going for a more mythical interpretation, not necessarily realism.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing I noticed a lot this viewing, is that the movie, or Raimi, is pretty much willing to, like, suspend, I guess, practicality and realism for the sake of a joke or a scene. There's a lot of stuff that I was watching it and I was like, that doesn't make sense, like, on an actual realistic level. Like, two scenes in particular, at the beginning when he first gets his web powers and he's swinging across the street. When he gets to the other building, his feet are dragging on the gravel. But then the punchline is he's like 5 feet above the air, above the ceiling, and he smacks straight into the board. I'm like, that doesn't make sense, but that's funny enough that I don't care. And the other scene is also at the end of the movie when he's fighting the goblin on the bridge, and the goblin is like taunting him. He's going under the bridge, and he gets hit in the head with an object, and I'm like, wait a minute, he's under the thing. There's no way that.
Well, yeah, and I noticed that too, and I'm just like, man, these New Yorkers have really good aim.
Everything just has a boomerang in it, so it's curving all over the place. I think he tactically chose. Is it worth the realism, or can I just or is the emotion or the joke or the punchline more important than, like, the statistical realism of what's happening here?
Yes, and I mean, it's a lot like the comics themselves, because the comics themselves always played kind of fast and loose with how the world worked. I mean, it's like, oh yeah, all these heroes are somehow all in New York and not running into each other on a regular basis. And I kind of like how it mimicked that, where it's like, hey, yeah, we know that no one's going to believe any of this, and we don't care. And it was something that I also noticed while watching it, and granted, the Nostalgia Critics' discussion of the films did put the thought in my head of, oh, well, you can definitely tell that the real world did seep in, since while the film was in post-production, you had the 9/11 terror attacks, and that definitely colored some of the imagery and the sense of unity from the New Yorkers from that bridge scene. I'm of the opinion that maybe that was already there, and maybe it was just a sort of sad but kind of needed coincidence where, like, okay, you had New York coming together already, it just so happens that it was well-timed.
I'm on the same boat. I don't know if that was a reshoot, if they had maybe, gone back and added some of those quotes or scenes, because I haven't seen the Nostalgia Critic, but I did watch Bob Chipman, Movie Bob's, one, like, hour and a half long essay on why Spider-Man is as great as it is. And it's one of those things where, like, this movie did come out, I think, at the right time, especially in the right city for the right type of people, right? Because, we had just suffered 9/11 a year prior, not even a whole year prior. It had been probably about 6 months. This came out in April of 2002. This is like the movie that people needed, and I think if it had been anybody else, there would have been this kind of I want to say criticism, because how can you have like a Superman movie come out in 2001 and the criticism is like, why, if this isn't the real world, why didn't he stop 9/11, right? And when you have somebody like Spider-Man, it's like there's no way. Like that's not even a question. That's because he's such a small personal character, and that's kind of what works.
Yeah, it kind of goes into kind of the axiom, I guess, that Marvel tends to follow. The best way to compare it that with DC characters like Superman, they're characters that you look up to, whereas Marvel tries to create characters that you can relate to. And given that Spider-Man, Peter Parker as a character starts out as the everyman, as someone who's just a relatable dweeb, I think it kind of makes that a little bit easier to think of, oh, well, he was just a Joe Schmo like me, who basically had something happen, and he basically is now doing it using his new abilities to help other people, and that kind of makes the character a little bit more relatable than, say, Superman to an extent.
Yeah. And you know what? I think it's funny because, Superman had been... I mean, not to, to belittle Batman, but I think Superman here is kind of the perfect, almost foil to the Superman to the Spider-Man formula, because they're so similar in what they're achieving, right? Like, they're both trying to be symbols of hope. They're both meant to be something you could aspire to. Spider-Man, obviously, is meant to be a little bit more realistic. But I think that really seeps into the script and the movie. There's a lot of references to Superman in here. Him when he's saying up and away web, when Aunt May tells him, "You're not Superman." That was fairly obvious. And I think my favorite is during the Thanksgiving Day parade, when the Goblin is throwing out bombs and he goes to change into Spider-Man. He's doing the Superman thing. He's ripping off his clothes, the emblems on his chest, and it's scene for scene a recreation of like the Christopher Reeve Superman transformation, where he's also ripping off the button shirt Superman logo underneath. And I think it kind of plays to that thing you said, where it's Superman is who you aspire to be, and in a sense that's what Spider-Man is trying to do. He's aspiring to be Superman. It's not spelled out for you, but it's certainly there,
especially when a lot of the imagery from the Superman films kind of became shorthand for a lot of other comic characters, even in DC's wheelhouse. The whole, oh, I'm in my civilian clothes, quickly run, open up the shirt, and you see the logo beneath. That kind of became a common shorthand for a lot of characters for a while, until a few other changes in the comics, which I guess they realized, oh, well, everyone does that, kind of why you never see phone booths anymore. It's just, it went away with the times.
That's one of the other things I really like about this movie, was the costume. I think, a lot of people were happy, that we got it, period. But I think the costume looks really good. It doesn't deviate all that much from the source material.
Yeah, like, the only real deviation was, like, the sunglass-type lenses, but then again, given that they established that Peter, yeah, he's a science whiz, but he's not a super intelligent science major in this particular iteration. And so instead of like, oh, I'm going to create these special, like, changing lenses, it's just like, no, I'm just going to put sunglasses there. I mean, it's New York. Buildings are reflective.
Yeah, and I mean, when we did get the most accurate Spider-Man costume, we kind of got one of the worst Spider-Man movies, so...
Yeah.
Count your blessings.
Yeah, I mean, especially, and I could definitely tell that there were some things that were planted in this film that were kind of mishandled later due to executive meddling, where they kind of alluded to Eddie Brock, especially when they're doing the first scene of J. Jonah Jameson, like, saying, hey, put out a cash reward for these pictures of Spider-Man. It was something I noticed where one of the reporters was like, oh yeah, Eddie's been working on it, he just can't get a picture of him, and I'm just like, oh, that was how they were referencing Eddie Brock.
Yeah, I noticed a couple things and kind of, looking into a little bit of the production behind Spider-Man. It's a different writing team for both movies, different screenwriters for both movies. So I think there's a couple of nods. There's obviously the Eddie Brock stuff you mentioned, but also when Peter Parker's looking for a job and Harry asks him, oh, did Dr. Connors fire you? And I was like, hey, he's supposed to be his teacher in the next one.
It's just funny, like a lot of those little inklings and seeds that they put in that I, again, didn't notice before when I first saw it, because, again, I wasn't as familiar with the character in the comics since I was mostly familiar with the cartoon.
And I think there might have been nods, but I also get the feeling that they just weren't sure there were going to be more of these movies. And I think they were like, we could throw Eddie Brock in here, but that might be too much character, too much blah, blah, blah. If we just throw a bone for, like, the fans, hopefully that's enough.
Yeah, and I kind of miss those days, to be honest, because now you have these superhero movies that they know they're going to get sequels, so it's just like, let's pepper in these Easter eggs, and any plot holes that come up will say, oh, we'll explain the plot hole in a later movie.
It's also like, back to a nicer period when you could have an Easter egg, and that's all it was. Like, nowadays, when Captain America, they mentioned Stephen Strange, everybody lost their mind, and in here, they mentioned Eddie Brock, and everybody was like, oh, neat.
When did you first see Spider-Man?
I wish I could give you the exact date. I know it was in May. I know it was around my birthday because my birthday's in the end of May. And I know this because there's no way that my parents and my uncle just weren't going to take me to see this movie. I saw this in 2002 in theaters when I was 11, almost 12 years old. So I first saw it when it first came out.
I see. I'm kind of with you there, where I was about that same age, where I was kind of in 6th grade. Much like you, I saw it in the theater when it first came out. I was a fan of the character. I don't remember if it was in April or May. I don't even really remember which theater I saw it in, but that kind of shows that we were both pretty young when this film came out, and so it was in a prime position to really kind of latch on to those very important childhood nostalgia feel things.
Especially going back and watching it now, like, I swelled up a lot, even in the non-emotional moments, because I was remembering the emotions I felt. Like, I was watching scenes and I was like, I remember watching this and just being so excited, and I don't know, it was I don't have nostalgia for a lot of things, and this movie is certainly one of those that I have nostalgia for, and maybe I'm an apologist to this movie for its flaws because of it, but I don't care.
I'm kind of in the same way, because I was having the same feeling as I was watching through it, both the scenes that I remember seeing in the theater, but I was also really into the tie-in video game they released around the same time. I played that, I beat it multiple times, and also cheated a lot with a lot of the passwords, like, oh, unlimited webbing, oh, play as the Green Goblin, and all of the fun little things. I remember especially because on the DVD, the film was actually one of the first DVDs that we ever bought when DVDs were like the new thing. Like, the first was the Powerpuff Girls movie for my older sister, and then this film was like the first one. It was actually a birthday present, so that's kind of also why it latched on, because this was like one of the first DVDs, the first time I saw all the special features, all the behind the scenes stuff, especially like the whole, oh, watch the movie and press the button to see a behind the scenes of, oh, here's how we painted the spiders, here's how we did this effect.
I guess I wasn't that lucky. We didn't have all that much money. We were a rental family, so everything we got was from Blockbuster back when those were around. So I didn't own the first DVD I owned that was like gifted to me that I was able to keep like in my stuff was Spider-Man 3, and it was always like from my parents, it was always like a sort of, sorry we couldn't get you the first ones, hopefully this is okay. And it's, with all its faults and everything, I still enjoy Spider-Man 3, but that's not what we're talking about today.
Yeah, but I think even with the flaws, it still kind of speaks to the strength of the Raimi trilogy, where even with some of the goofier moments, it still got to the heart of the characters. It still could make you care about what's happening. And it's something that, granted, the third film struggled with it a little bit, but something that I've even seen that the newer Spider-Man films, I mean, I don't know if Homecoming will do a good job of this or not, but that's something that even the modern superhero films kind of struggle with, is really getting you to actually care about the story and about the characters.
it's a thing where you care about them because you're supposed to. And this one, you really care because you feel there's real stakes for him, and they feel real. And I don't know why that's hard for like some of the newer movies to kind of recreate. And I think it's mostly because it's personal, right? Like they're personal attacks on his character, whereas with Iron Man or everything, even if it is personal, it becomes a world affecting thing. Even Iron Man 1, which is the most personal Iron Man movie. Well, the most personal good Iron Man movie. The big reveal, the big fight at the end is like, oh, we had to stop him because if I don't stop him, he's gonna sell weapons to the whole world, to terrorists, right? Like it becomes a little less personal. And this movie, even though it kind of gets away from him, they're still attacking his family, they're still attacking his loved ones, and even though they're attacking the city, they're attacking like a train thing full of kids. It's still personal because it's him having to make a decision and having to what is he gonna do?
Yeah, especially, and I think that what really helps is the fact that we start out with Mary Jane, Harry, and Peter all in high school, so we do actually see them grow over the course of the story. And so it's kind of a case of we know where they've come from, we know what they're trying to do, how they're trying to get to those goals. And I especially noticed with how you slowly saw Harry at first being kind of an optimist like Peter, trying to kind of do his own thing, but then you see him slowly become more and more like Norman Osborn, especially after the whole moment of him, even though it was him slipping into the goblin persona of, oh yeah, like Mary Jane's gonna leave you because she's only after your money. And you just kind of see that slow metamorphosis of, oh, Peter's becoming a better person through this time of being a hero, and you see Harry's more or less fall to darkness that kind of has a payoff in the later films.
That's really well done, except one of the criticisms with Spider-Man, and it's criticism I have now that I didn't have before, but it is that Mary Jane has barely any growth. She's kind of just there as a prize. Watching it this time around, it actually kind of bothered me because she goes from okay, she knows who Peter Parker is, or at the bare minimum, she knows who he is in high school because he's that nerd that everybody makes fun of. She just happens to be his next door neighbor. But by the end of the movie, I didn't think it was realistic that she's, oh, I'm super in love with you, and it's like,
yeah,
really, I feel like there wasn't enough of that in the beginning to make it. It just really felt like, this is your prize, Peter Parker.
Yeah, and that is something I did notice, and it was kind of a problem with a lot of superhero movies during the late 90s, early 2000s, where they're kind of trying to paint them a bit as like, oh, I have to be the loner for the sake of the greater good. Like, that was a problem with Daredevil especially. It very much was a symptom of that, and I'm kind of with you. Mary Jane did get kind of the shaft, especially given, I know a lot of comic fans complain just the drastic departure of her character as opposed to how she was in the comics, where she was already as an established model and actress. For the sake of the story, I kind of get what they were going for, the implying of, okay, well, they're both basically New York kids growing up, to kind of create that sense of attachment, especially since by that point nobody even really remembered who Gwen Stacy was.
Yeah, and I think this was a movie that came out way before the new comics boom happened. It was right in between when comics kind of stopped being mainstream popular and right before they got super mainstream popular. So I think they were able to gloss over Gwen Stacy super, super sly and super easily with minimal criticisms because, it's been well known or well established at this point that, Mary Jane is meant to be the love interest. So I think a lot of even diehard comic book fans were like, okay, that's fair.
I think even at this point in the comics when the film came out, they were actually married as well, because I know that there were some changes in the comics that were made to kind of make it more like the movie that were undone during, well, One More Day. Because I know that they had swapped over to the organic webbing that the film version had for a while, and instead of the web shooters, which as a kid, even though I liked the film, that was one thing that did bother me as a kid, was it, where I'm just like, why did they make it organic? I liked the fact that it was the web shooters.
I liked it too, but I think I actually think the organic web shooters really paid off in the second movie. But I actually really like the organic stuff, because to me, back then, it made sense. Okay, spider powers, spider web. However, now as an adult, I think I'm like, they would be coming out of his butt. So, it's perspective.
Yeah, not nearly as dumb as when the comics tried giving him, those weird, oh, they're like these claws that come out of your wrists because this is what spiders would eventually evolve into. I mean, even with the character, it was also coming off of a lot of things like the Clone Saga and all of these other really desperate gambits to try to keep Spider-Man relevant prior to the films.
I think one of the other things I really enjoyed about this movie was how when they're at the spider exhibit thing at the beginning, how they kind of let you know all the powers he's gonna have. Really sly, they're talking about these spiders, they have super strong webbing, they have like a spider sense, they have this thing and that thing, and like it's all kind of done in the background. If you don't know who Spider-Man is, this is like a totally first exposure. It kind of gives you an idea of what you might get later. Like I actually thought it was super well done. I thought a lot of the beginning was very well done. Watching it now with a more critical eye.
Yeah, definitely had a really good sense of build-up, and I kind of like how even after he's bit by the spider, it kind of brings it home of, hey, remember the fact that we mentioned that these spiders are being spliced into one spider? Well, here's a quick reminder of, yeah, this is what they were doing. So, yeah, stuff's about to go down.
I really like it. And I think, kind of talking about their power sets, one of the things that bugs me is kind of how inconsistent the goblin bombs are. Like, that's one of those things that kind of bugged me a little bit, was the first time you see the goblin bomb, it just blows up the experimental suit. Then the next time you see it, it vaporizes like executives.
And leaves their skeletons.
Yeah, that leaves skeletons.
I remember laughing at that where it's just like, okay, and it's like, oh, and it left them as skeletons. Gotta work on that Evil Dead goodness, don't you, Raimi?
Apparently your bombs are weak against calcium, so, might want to work on that. But then, like, the next time they're, like, the blade drones thing, and then the time after that, they go back to the normal bombs. And I was just like, wait a minute. Nobody explains this to me. And, okay, whatever. It's fine, I guess. Fine.
Well, yeah, and I guess that could be kind of explained away of, okay, well, it's probably just more Oscorp weaponry, given that the government persona probably just raided a bunch of stuff and went, oh, this looks nice and deadly.
Yeah, pretty much. I just really enjoyed this movie. It's well done. It has a lot of flaws, which I think we've pointed out a fair bit of them, but I think the movie is so focused on the story it's telling and the atmosphere and the mood that, like, a lot of these flaws, I think, are acceptable.
And I think it kind of goes to that same thing of, yeah, it has a lot of flaws, but it does kind of the main thing that I always say a film needs to do. It gets you to care, it gets you invested, it gets you to suspend your disbelief, even though, yeah, it's a little bit goofy of Goblin and Spider-Man just chatting on the rooftop, but hey, you've already been established of, okay, well, this is a film where there's already a lot of silliness, so yeah, I'll just roll with it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, we talked about Willem Dafoe as an actor, as the Green Goblin. But I think Tobey Maguire also had just a really good performance in this. To me, when I think Peter Parker, I still think Tobey Maguire. Because his performance in this and the performance in Spider-Man 2 are just really well done. Like, there's not a lot of verbal exposition. There's a lot of scenes where he's crying, where he's pensive. And he does a lot of really good acting with his face. They do a lot of close-ups on his face, so you just see the emotion. Like, exactly what he's feeling without anybody coming in and being like, oh, Peter, are you sad because it's graduation and your uncle wasn't there? No, like, you see it. That's very well known. And then he mentions it. Then he's like, I missed him.
And one thing that I really like here, and it's something that a lot of Hollywood films didn't do, where it's like, yeah, he's crying, but they don't try to have it be the sexy cry. They make it clear of, okay, he's sad, he's distraught, and it's not an emotion that you're going to look sexy while having. Your face is going to look kind of dumb when you're crying, and that kind of made it feel more real, where it's like, oh, it's not him having the, I'm a stoic hero, but the single tear. It's more like,
Yeah, he is not a pretty crier. But that works fine. Like, it gets the point. It feels genuine, like, more than anything. Like, a lot of the emotions in this movie, they feel genuine, and I think that's the important stuff. Even the super cheesy parts where the Goblin crashes in on Aunt May doing she's reciting the prayer. Like, there's, like, seemingly genuine fear in her eyes. There is fear, real fear, even though he's yelling at her, finish it! Like,
and again, you can just tell with Willem Dafoe's vocal delivery, you can tell he's just having fun with it, because it's very much, it's kind of like seeing him play Freddy Krueger almost, where he's like, yeah, I'm the villain, and the villain is the kind of villain that is literally gonna get off on this sort of thing, of like the whole, oh, I know what part of the prayer you're in on, I'm gonna relish this.
It's just it's just a really well done movie. And I think one of the things, we haven't talked about it yet, but I think one of the great things this movie did, apart from sticking really closely to like the mythos, it kind of picked specific things it wanted to stay really close to, and other stuff it decided to stray away from, organic web, Gwen Stacy, blah blah blah. But I think the one thing it did that was totally original to the movie was that kiss, the alleyway kiss. And it was like a moment where even, rewatching it, knowing it's coming up, I'm like, oh my god, it's a kiss, like stupid excited over a thing I've already seen like a dozen times.
Yeah, I mean, I remember kind of how ubiquitous that kiss became. I mean, there was all the Mad TV parodies. There was the famous MTV award of Best Kiss going to Tobey Maguire for that scene that was later made fun of for Tropic Thunder. But even just looking at the way the scene is constructed, I've seen scenes like that before in prior Batman films, and so it very much felt like a fresh twist on the type of scene we'd seen 1,000 times. The main love interest gets saved by the hero, but doesn't know the hero is the person they know in their real life. But it's just like, hey, it's a nice twist that actually felt pretty in character. It's like, yeah, we've seen it a billion times before, but hey, let's see how Spider-Man would do this sort of scene.
I also just really like that scene because you couldn't cast an actor without showing their face, right? Iron Man, we see Tony Stark's face a lot of the movie, in and out of the costume, right? And this movie wasn't afraid to just mask up Tobey Maguire for a good portion of the Spider-Man scenes. But I felt like when they did that alleyway scene, he doesn't have his mask on, and I feel it was a little bit of a moment where they were like, you know what? Let's prove to you that Tobey Maguire really is up to the task. Let's show you that he really can do some of the stunts and fight scenes in here. And I think it played out really well with the whole mysterious thing too, because it's all in the shadows. It's all really well done.
Yeah, I remember even seeing some of the screen tests on the features that come on both the Blu-ray and the DVD, where they kind of did the initial test when they were still auditioning people for Peter Parker. And you definitely see like the early shades of that, hey, yeah, let's use the shadows to our advantage. And I definitely like how they kind of explained of, okay, he was in a rush, so he didn't have time to get on his mask. And it was very much, hey, I gotta go because I know something bad's about to go down.
It's a super, I think it's a good scene. I also love the fact that, like, he doesn't mask his voice, but, like, nobody picks up on it.
That's kind of something they do establish where, at least with how they establish how he fights a lot of crimes, where he's very much, unlike, say, Batman, who was trying to be terrifying and disguising his voice, they pretty much imply, okay, he gets in, he webs him up, and then he basically leaves right away. And so I think there can be kind of a given of, okay, he's probably in and out like that he's not going to really be sticking around for anyone long enough to hear his voice.
And I think it's funny because, like, it makes sense, right, for the character. He's not trying to be intimidating. He's the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But I think one of the things that cracks me up is when the Goblin invades J. Jonah's office. And Peter Parker was literally just talking to him, disappears, comes back as Spider-Man, and talks straight to Jonah Jameson. And Jonah just does not pick up on it. And that's fine. I get it's a goofy movie. It's fine. We can accept
Well, yeah, and that does bring me to the point, probably the best J. Jonah Jameson, J.K. Simmons. Out of all the things I saw in that movie, that was just like, that is literally, they ripped him from the comics. That is J. Jonah Jameson.
There is no more perfect casting than J. Jonah, J.K. Simmons. Like, I can't imagine anybody else, and you can tell nobody's gonna try and top it. Like, they've never recasted Jonah. They've never mentioned him. Like, I think they're trying to stay as far away as possible from J. Jonah Jameson as they can, because he's so popular with the fans. He's a meme. He's synonymous with the character. Like, I just don't think you can really do anything.
You can't top that, especially when you look at all the subsequent cartoons and how they basically try to mimic J.K. Simmons' delivery of J. Jonah Jameson's lines. I remember, especially in Spectacular Spider-Man, that they really tried hewing close to, I don't know if it was that cartoon or a different cartoon where they actually did get J.K. Simmons to actually voice J. Jonah Jameson. I don't know which one it was, but I know it was a very short-lived one that they actually had J.K. Simmons come in.
Was it the one with Drake Bell that was like weirdly CGI animated?
It might have been, given that, and it makes sense given that it was that I believe Columbia had a major stake in MTV if they didn't outright own it, so
it might have been that.
It might have been. Either that or it was just a very good voice double. It was very much just perfect casting that I don't think anybody's going to really try to top anytime soon, because I remember even the Amazing Spider-Man films didn't even try to have a new J. Jonah Jameson at all.
And I think, talking about perfect casting, this also, I still think that this Aunt May was perfect. To me, she's still like Aunt May. Like, she's the Aunt May that I imagined from the comics. The TV show, she's elderly, but she's like wise, but she's not too wise, right? She's still a person. She still has flaws, but you can see her as your own grandma or aunt. You know, I thought Rosemary Harris is still probably like the best Aunt May, and to me, it's gonna be real weird watching Marissa Tomei be Aunt May. That's uncomfortable.
For me, it was weird watching Sally Fields, and again, Sally Fields did a fairly good job with what she was given, but even then, I was still very much attached to the Rosemary Harris portrayal, both for nostalgia reasons, but just more of, well, that was how she was already established. And, well, I didn't really see Aunt May, I saw Sally Field.
Yeah, exactly. And that's going to be my problem with the new one coming up. I don't know. You know, and talking about the newer Spider-Man movies, there's something that this movie does that I absolutely adore. And it's that not everything has to be connected. The Green Goblin incident and the Spider incident are totally separate events. They're not related to one another. It doesn't all revolve around a single thing.
Well, yeah, like it wasn't Oscorp that was modifying the spiders, it was Columbia University.
Right, and I love that because it's these totally separate events that one could have happened, one could have not, that kind of converge into the big final fight. And it's really nice and really refreshing because it feels like there's no blame, right? Like also he has no Joe Chill. Like, his guy dies. Right? He's not like an Oscorp employee who was strapped for money or something. Everything is totally disconnected, but it all comes to Spider-Man for a different reason.
It also kind of helps to really inform kind of the overarching arcs between both Peter Parker and Norman Osborn, where you have Peter Parker, he's just doing his own thing, and it just so happens the spider bites him, whereas Norman Osborn goes through the transformation because he's trying to rush development on the human enhancement drug. He's basically after power, both from money from the government, but it kind of really shows Peter was just, if he had never been bitten, he's just like, okay, I'm just gonna do my own thing, whereas Norman was after power, and that was ultimately his own undoing, was that lust for power. Even though he may not have been aware of it as Norman, the Green Goblin just kind of brought that out of him.
Yeah. And like I said, one of the things I like about everything kind of being isolated and eventually converging is that Spider-Man feels genuine to being Spider-Man. Like, it's not a thing where he's like, I have to be Spider-Man because I have to track down my uncle's killer. It's a thing where, like, his uncle dies, he he kills his uncle's killer. Essentially, the movie could have been over there. It wouldn't be called Spider-Man, but the movie could have been over there. That arc was done. But I like the fact that time passes. He graduates from high school. He's kind of presumably has a job. And it's something that he remembers, like my uncle told me this. He said, great power, great responsibility. It's my responsibility to be Spider-Man. There's no catalyst. It's just out of his own will.
Well, yeah, especially when you consider, and this is something that the Amazing Spider-Man kind of mishandled, where it's not just, it's because Michael died. It's because, if I had stopped this guy from running off, my uncle would still be alive. And so it very much has that notion of guilt that kind of caused him to fly off the handle to go after the robber, because it's just like, hey, it was my fault that my uncle got killed because of my own greed. That's something that the comics kind of waffled a little bit for a while until they finally set it in stone. But here, and this is something that it definitely makes you feel that, where it's just like, okay, I'm confronting my robber, and oh, crap.
Yeah. Like I said, totally isolated incidents that all come into Spider-Man. Like, it's all these things where, he might have had control over it, he might not have. But eventually, they all kind of end up becoming his responsibility, which really ties in thematically to Spider-Man, is, the sense of responsibility. And I think if the movie had played out differently, I think the Goblin could have been a really good catalyst for inspiring Spider-Man. Like, he could have been there and been like, I have these powers, there's this madman doing a thing, I have to do something. But I think it's a little bit more earnest, the fact that he decides to stop crime just for the sake of kind of being a good guy. And I think that gives you a better insight to his character. It doesn't make him seem so selfish, which, once again, really pays off in the next two movies, where he does become a little bit more selfish due to the fame of Spider-Man.
Well, yeah, and especially with the second film where he even contemplates, hey, I'm not sure if I can do this anymore, and it really kind of explores how he tries to give up Spider-Man and tries to basically have the life he could have had if he had stopped earlier, but then it, well, quite rightfully blows up in his face.
I think there's a lot of really good stuff. And I've said it before, I don't think any other filmmaker yet understands Spider-Man or gets him as well as Raimi does. There's a real earnest sense to him. Like, he feels like a genuine character. Like, he seems realistic considering all the sci-fi comic book elements. Which, Amazing Spider-Man, I don't think it was genuine. It really felt like we were like Sony was trying to cash in on the whole superhero craze. They're like iconic villains, iconic scenes, iconic this, blah blah blah. And that's kind of my problem with the Tom Holland Spider-Man coming up, is that it doesn't feel like he's becoming Spider-Man to be Spider-Man. He's becoming Spider-Man to get on Tony Stark's good side.
It's not about him becoming Spider-Man, it's about him trying to be an Avenger.
Exactly. And that's, like, you know, like I said, one of the things I love about this movie is that it's so self-contained that, you know, 15 years later, it stands alone really well. Like, even as a single movie, as a single movie that isn't part of a trilogy, it works well still.
It kind of reminds me, it was a behind-the-scenes story, because a teacher in my high school and college, I've mentioned him on and off on other podcasts, but he actually was a cameraman. He actually was on the crew for Spider-Man, and, like, one of the behind-the-scenes stories he always liked to tell was how, hey, a good director needs to be open to ideas from anybody. And so literally they were getting plate shots for an alley scene where he was going to be swinging in, and Raimi was basically like, hey, there's something missing from the scene. Something just doesn't look like this, doesn't feel like an alley. And my teacher, Mark Davis was his name, he basically heard someone in the crew said, hey, why don't we put in some newspapers in the alley? And Raimi latched on the idea. It was like, great, that's a good idea. It makes it to make it feel like an actual alley instead of, oh, we found this location and cleaned it up. It's like, okay, let's make it look like somebody could, you know, live here if they had a box.
You know, that's one of the other things, is that New York really feels really good. Like, there's not a lot of parts of it that feel like a set. A lot of it feels really genuine New York-ish. I mean, and that's, to be fair, that's coming from a guy who's never been to New York, so I'm assuming that's how New York felt in 2001. I like it. It has like a real like aesthetic to it, even though it's not, you know, fantastical and that type of stuff. But it does feel like New York, which I think is that's supposed to be the job.
Yeah, and especially, and the other thing I liked is that, yeah, it feels like New York, but it didn't date itself. I mean, yeah, there was the ripple effect from the terror attacks, but even then, even if the attacks never happened, it still would feel, you could very much see you could see this film being the way it is if the attacks never happened. That's kind of how, it's kind of that classic timeless version of New York that you don't really see nowadays, even in the Marvel movies.
I think it's funny, kind of going back to this whole, you know, the 9/11 attack. It reminds me, when the movie was coming out, one of the TV spots was like a helicopter webbed up between the Twin Towers, which, you know, that got taken out of syndication real fast. But I think one of the things I remember a lot was and I think it was in one of the trailers, there was a scene of him like swinging between the Twin Towers that, like, I think a lot of people were hyped up because, you know, they were such a landmark of the New York skyline, that to have, you know, Spider-Man swinging between them was like, oh, holy, you know, that's really cool. That's, of course Spider-Man would swing between the two things. So, like, I remember hearing a lot about a lot of deleted scenes, a lot of stuff that was altered because of the stuff, a lot of stuff that, you know, had to be taken out of syndication, like the commercial and stuff like that. And the video game also, like, I think had like an extra moment of development because they had to take out a lot of references to stuff. It did a lot of that stuff well. It handled the situation well.
I like that it didn't call attention to it. And that's really the big distinction here, because especially recently there have been a lot of films, especially when there's like a lot of problems in development, where they'll call attention to the fact, kind of like in Ghostbusters. But here it's just like, yeah, we had to make these changes, but let's try to minimize the fact that we made these changes and still put out an entertaining movie.
And, you know, kind of thinking about this, you know, thinking about the movie in the context of when it took place, it kind of makes, obviously we haven't seen Spider-Man Homecoming as of this recording, But it kind of makes that airplane scene in Spider-Man Homecoming feel a little dirty now. Kind of thinking about this movie and its time, and like, I'm just like, I don't know how I feel about that anymore.
Yeah, yeah, especially, and now it's maybe even kind of reconsider some of the moments from the PlayStation 4 demo that they had up at E3, where I'm thinking, oh yeah, the helicopter wrecking ball. Ugh.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know, man. Like, something about this movie, I just really enjoyed it. I really loved it, and I think, it came out at the right time when people, specifically New Yorkers, needed something to like lighten the emotional load, right? Like, this was that movie. Like, yes, it was somber. It had its personal, angry, sad moments, but man, is it fun. Is it funny? It's lighthearted.
Yeah, it pretty much is, well, a comic book movie before they were everywhere. I remember as a kid, main reason why I was excited is because they used to be rare. Like, these movies used to be events where it's like, oh, and nowadays it's like, oh, they're making a Captain America. But back then it was like, oh, they're making a Spider-Man movie. And this was shortly after seeing like the deleted scene from X-Men. It was an outtake where one of the Teamsters run out into it was a shot in X-Men, and one of the Teamsters was wearing a Spider-Man costume, and he runs out into the scene and he's like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, I'm in the wrong movie, my bad. And you just hear the cast and the crew just crack up, because they didn't realize it was actually like getting ready to be made at that time. It was just like, oh yeah, it's New York, they'd run into each other.
And I think one of the other things that's really really great about Spider-Man, considering once again when it came out, was that year, or I think it was the month prior, I think it was early in April, episode 2 of Star Wars had come out. I don't know about you, but I know how people feel about the prequels. So I think the fact that we were getting like a nerd movie that we had always wanted, like the same way we had always wanted the prequels, I think there was a bit of like cautious optimism, because we were like, wait a minute, what if this one's not good either?
Especially when you consider how many times, because they had tried getting a Spider-Man movie off the ground since the 80s. It changed hands. You had directors writing intentionally terrible scripts to get out of it. Like, there's James Cameron's famous draft where it had a lot of weird ideas. Oh, Peter Parker's on a ship, and he doesn't call himself Spider-Man, and instead of Doc Octopus, it's Professor Octopus. And Spider-Man becomes gigantic, like turns 30 feet and is blue. Like, very much all the ways it could have been bad, and you can tell it was written that way because James Cameron didn't want any part of the project. They just kept bugging him about it, so he's just like, okay, here's how I would do it. And unlike, say, with Godzilla, they're just like, okay, we get it, James. We get it. We'll stop asking. Jeez.
And I think it's funny because I was reading up a little bit on Spider-Man, so I could get my dates correct and all that stuff coming out in May, and, the year it came out and everything. I think one of the things that was funny to me was the amount of directors they tried to get on this. Apart from James Cameron, they had like Roland Emmerich, Ang Lee, Chris Columbus, M. Night Shyamalan, David Fincher. All these guys were asked and considered. Or considered, like, it's holy crap. Trying to get Spider-Man movie out back then was a nightmare. Whereas nowadays, if you put up an open call for like who wants to direct Spider-Man, you will get 1,000 hands up in the air. And I think, fans were like, I don't know, man, like, Blade was okay, but who cares about Blade?
Well, yeah, and like the only other contemporary it really had was the X-Men movies, which, while good for its time, definitely wasn't the greatest interpretation of the characters, but for people who were comic book fans, it was like, hey, we know it's not great, but we'll take what we can get.
And I think it's funny, too, because, we praise the casting of Spider-Man a lot, J.K. Simmons, Willem Dafoe, Tobey Maguire, so forth and so forth, right? But I remember everybody complaining about the X-Men casting, and everybody was like, oh, Hugh Jackman's too tall, Halle Berry's too short. This guy for Cyclops, really? Like, the only casting anybody thought was good was Xavier. And I think, I don't know, I can't remember too well, but I think even people were a little iffy on Ian McKellen as Magneto.
Yeah, that was because with X-Men, they went with mostly unknowns. They were basically trying to bank on Halle Berry kind of being the main star to carry the film, but they didn't expect Hugh Jackman to become as popular as he did.
And I think it's funny because I remember complaining about Ian McKellen, because I was like, Magneto's supposed to be buff as balls in the comics. Like, he's ripped. Ian McKellen, not so much.
Yeah, though that does remind me, as I was watching this prior to coming on the show, I noticed, I think there was actually a cameo from Ellen Page in Spider-Man, like, just as one of the bystanders.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a very, very quick shot of her going like, look over there, and it was like in the scene at the World Unity thing when the Goblin attacks basically a major area the first time. It was very quick, and I'm just like, I just had to do a double take, and I was like, is that Ellen Page?
For me, one of the castings I didn't realize, and kind of watching it, I was like, wait a minute, this person looks way too familiar. It's Elizabeth Banks is Betty Brant in the Daily Bugle. And I was like, when I heard her voice on this viewing, I was like, that sounds really familiar. I had to look it up, and I was like, holy crap, that's Elizabeth Banks.
Of course, I remember there's always the fan favorite, like, they're in every Raimi movie because, like, of course, everyone's going to expect us to mention Bruce Campbell as the wrestling commentator, Randy Savage as Bonesaw, and, of course, Ted Raimi as one of the other reporters at the Daily Bugle, who was basically talking about the advertising budget and stuff like that, and I'm just like, it's Joxer.
And I was looking this up because I was curious about who else was in here that I didn't remember. And Lucy Lawless is the punk girl. Lucy Lawless is the one that's a guy with 8 arms. Sounds hot. I was like, what the crap?
That's the thing with Sam Raimi. Every director has, like, those same people they like to feature in each of their movies. And with Sam Raimi, it's his brother Ted, Bruce Campbell, and Lucy Lawless. Those are, like, the 3 people, no matter what movie he's making, he'll find a way to work them in.
Also, somebody else I didn't realize was in this movie, because it looks nothing like him anymore, but Joe Manganiello. He's from Magic Mike, but he's Flash Thompson. I was like, what the crap? How? That doesn't even look, it's not even the same man anymore.
Okay, now that just paints things in a whole context of, wow, things did not turn out well for Flash then.
Flash was so ashamed he went to work out, and when he realized he had no marketable job skills, became a stripper.
Oh man, but yeah, that just goes to show that there were a lot of people that were back then relatively unknown that were in this movie. So yeah, you could almost make like a 6 Degrees game out of it, where it's like the 6 Degrees of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man film.
And also, speaking of like cameos, this also has like one of the quietest, most low-key Stan Lee cameos we've ever seen.
Yep. It's because it was another one of those double take-ups. Oh, I guess that was the Stan Lee cameo before they became like the big thing everyone looked for in the film, which I guess is I guess it's kind of funny. Like when you look at interviews with Stan of the kind of scenes he liked seeing and being in, it's just like, okay, well, it was a small cameo, but I'm sure he probably really enjoyed the scene he got to be featured in, because he likes those types of action scenes. I remember in an interview where he was doing a cameo in The Trial of the Incredible Hulk with Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno. It was a scene where the Hulk was supposed to Hulk out in a courtroom. He was one of the jurors, and he wanted to kind of go and run with the other jurors as part of the scene. It's like, oh, it's hulking out, we gotta run. And literally Bill Bixby, who was directing, he's like, nope, Stan, get out of there. We're bringing in the double. And he's like, no, but I want. It's like, no, Stan, we don't want you to break. We'll bring in the double.
And I think it's funny, too, because, like, apparently he was meant to have a bigger cameo, and he was supposed to offer somebody a pair of glasses and be like, that's like the kind that they use, like that the X-Men use. Because I think they were supposed to look like Cyclops' glasses. But I guess there was problems with licensing, and because, you know...
Yeah, because Fox had the X-Men, Sony... Well, this was Columbia before they were bought by Sony, so it was very much Columbia had the rights to Spider-Man, and so I'm guessing that's probably what put the kibosh on that.
Yeah. Which is funny to me, because at the end of the movie, where it's just that like 2 minutes of him swinging through New York, there's a part where he's like going up parallel to a building as he's swinging, and it's a Sony building. It has a giant Sony logo, and it's kind of a blink and you miss it type. I guess it's an Easter egg, but yeah.
Either that or product placement, because there was quite a bit of that in this film.
Yeah, fair enough.
It was funny seeing like oh, there's a product that doesn't exist anymore, like Singular. Yeah, like I just looked at it, I was like, oh, there's all these products that they're plugging that don't exist anymore at all.
I can't go buy this anymore.
I mean, if I wanted to, I could probably buy the Suntory whiskey, so there's that.
Yeah. I mean, eBay is a thing that exists, so I mean, you could probably get everything in here, so, you know. Could I get me a goblin bomb that leaves behind skeletons? Because that would be rad.
Now that just needs to be paired with a goblin bomb that just makes all the inanimate objects start laughing and giggling. I mean, if any villain would have a bomb like that, it would be the Green Goblin.
Yeah, pretty much. I also did think it was funny, and there's no backstory or real personal, like, character reason for this, but I love the fact that his room is just filled with masks. Just a bunch of masks all over the place for no real reason, and it's like, ha, nice.
Yeah, it definitely makes for some good foreshadowing, that it does.
Oh, definitely.
Alright, well, looking at the time, we're actually coming to the end of our show here. Thank you very much to Aldo Gomez for being with me tonight.
Thank you for giving me a reason and opportunity to watch this film again, and then thanks for letting me talk about it with you for an hour.
Yeah, same here. I was definitely glad to revisit this. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to promote for the listeners who are listening to this after the fact?
You know, talking about stuff that really hits a home run on the first go-around, I'm actually doing a little analysis video on My Hero Academia's first season. I think it's a really good first season. I actually love it. It's a good superhero cartoon show in the same vein that, like, I think Spider-Man is a really good superhero movie. They're both really lighthearted. They're both really good. I think if you like... Actually, you know what? Screw it. If you like Spider-Man, you should probably go watch My Hero Academia.
Especially since I've heard it took a lot of inspiration from American comics. And there was even, like, comparisons of the upcoming anime Stan Lee is working on. I don't know what the studio is, but people were like saying, "Oh, but this is very similar to My Hero Academia," and a lot of people are just like, "It's Stan Lee. Does anyone really care?"
That's pretty much how I feel about any time Stan Lee is gonna come out with a new project. I'm like, is it worth it anymore?
Although that does make me wish that Disney would release the Japanese Spider-Man series on DVD.
Oh, that would be great.
Because Marvel did stream it on their website for a time, but then they just took the videos down when they realized, hey, we don't want to maintain this stream anymore.
I know, just at least do me a favor and throw them on Netflix. Throw me a bone.
Yeah, I'm sure Toei would be more than happy to, because the reason they haven't really been released in Japan is because Marvel has such a stranglehold on the license where they're just like, hey, you want to release anything related to this series? And it's not the giant robot? Well, you gotta pay us.
And I think it's funny, too, because in the recent comics, Spider-Man, as he's called because Japanese romanization, he has now become canon to the Spider-Man universe.
Yes.
Thanks to Spider-Verse.
Yep.
So.
Alright.
You know.
Well, to wrap things up, if people want to get a hold of you and see kind of both the analysis of My Hero Academia as well as many of the other pieces of content you like to produce on the internet, where can people find you?
You can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/boardoffline. You can also find me on my website at boardoffline.com. That's where I have written reviews or thought pieces every once in a while. They're both really irregular release dates, but you're more than likely to see content on the website. And also you can reach out to me on Twitter at twitter.com/steamboattaco.
All right, and on that note, for those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion of Spider-Man. If you want to see more of Rhapsody in Cinema, you can always find it here at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/StudioGhostUtah. You can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/Romney'sReviews, no apostrophe, and on Twitter at Romney'sReviews, no apostrophe S, because, well, it was taken. And on that is our show for this week, month. I'm not sure how frequent I'll be uploading these, but that is it for this episode. Thank you once again to Aldo, and thank you, listeners, and I hope you all have a good one.